This video is made possible by Vincero Watches, luxury handcrafted watches at fair prices. You can check them out at vincerowatches.com/brainfood. So on the surface, this pocket watch could be any other high-end watch from the mid-1800s. Inside, however, amidst the cogs and gears, is a different story. The words "Fort Sumpter was attacked by the rebels, thank God we have a government" are etched there, though the author of the text remembered writing something a tad different, as you'll soon see. The watch was Abraham Lincoln's. On April 13th, 1861, it was being repaired by Jonathan Dillon at M.W. Galt & Co. Jewelers. Dillon reported that he was just screwing on the dial when one Mr. Galt approached him with the news that shots had been fired on Fort Sumpter. Fort Sumpter was a federal fort in South Carolina, which had seceded from the Union in December of 1860. However, because the fort was owned by the federal government, it remained part of the Union and was manned by Union troops. To fire upon the fort was an act of war, and Dillon knew that he was hearing of history. Indeed, the shots fired on Fort Sumpter on April 12, 1861, kicked off the American Civil War. 45 years later, the Union, it was whole again, and Abraham Lincoln, well, he was dead. Dillon reported what he did to the New York Times, saying, "I unscrewed the dial and with a sharp instrument wrote on the metal beneath, 'The first gun is fired, slavery is dead. Thank God we have a president who at least will try.'" The watch was still around, but for whatever reason, the claim about the message wasn't investigated further, perhaps because people were skeptical of the legitimacy of Dillon's claim. It wasn't until Harry Rubenstein, the chief curator of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial exhibit, received a phone call from Douglas Stiles, Dillon's great-great-grandson, that the message came to light. Deciding to check for the message was a somewhat controversial move, as one doesn't take apart a priceless piece of history simply on a whim. Nevertheless, Rubenstein decided to take the risk, and in March 2009, the watch was carefully opened up at the National Museum of American History by master watchmaker George Thomas. Sure enough, there was a message there, just not quite what Dillon himself had reported, but the sentiment, it was more or less the same. Dillon was rushed while writing the message and perhaps meant for something with more meaning, which he added in the interview with the Times in 1906. Alternatively, perhaps he just ran out of room to give his full thought or exaggerated when talking to the press. There's also the fact to bear in mind that humans have amazingly imperfect memories about pretty much everything, even something that happened the previous day, let alone decades before, so the slip may well have not been intentional. Now, whatever the case, besides Dillon's message when they opened the watch in 2009, they were surprised to find other writing as well. Specifically, there are two other messages that were added to Dillon's. L. E. Groff's September 1864 Watch DC, and simply Jeff Davis. Jefferson Davis was, of course, the leader of the Confederacy during the Civil War. However, it's unknown whether he somehow got a hold of the watch after the war and scribbled his name in it, which is unlikely. If someone else named Jeff Davis managed to put his name in the watch, or if someone knew it was Lincoln's watch and decided to write Jeff Davis to be contrary, the 19th century watchmaker version of the classic insult format of Jeff Davis rules, Lincoln drools. As for L.E. Groff's, it's likely he was another jeweler. The watch would need to be taken in for cleaning every now and then, after all. It's possible that he wrote Jeff Davis in the watch in 1864 at the height of the Civil War. The inscription find doesn't change history, of course, but it's uplifting to think that Lincoln carried a message of support in his pocket during the war. And he did all of this without even knowing it was there. In the end, despite it saying something slightly different than what was originally reported, Stiles was happy to be able to see his ancestor's inscription, saying, "That's Lincoln's watch, and my ancestor put graffiti on it." Now, pocket watches today might not be all the rage, but wristwatches certainly are incredibly popular. You might have noticed me wearing this fine watch in recent videos. It's a Vincero chronograph. Chronograph means that all those fancy dials in the back there allow me to time things. It's actually pretty cool. And I chose this awesome blue dial with the silver on the outside and a lovely brown leather strap to go with it. I got this thing a couple of weeks ago. I stuck it on my wrist and I've been testing it out. Indeed, I've just been on holiday for 2 weeks. It was pretty humid. It rained a lot, and this thing looks exactly like the day I took it out of the box 2 weeks ago. Great condition, perfect, no scratches on there at all. So Vincero watches believe that luxury isn't about price or specification, it's about detail and craftsmanship, and their watches absolutely have that in spades. Unlike some other modern watches, which are all about minimalist design, these watches, they've flooded the market in recent years, Vincero is about setting yourself apart, and a watch like this certainly does that. They've got a great look, they've got a great feel, and by selling direct to the customer, they can deliver a great watch at about 1/10 of the price that you might expect. Also, there are tons of options on their website. They were even kind enough to hook me up with the smaller sized model to suit my tiny wrists. But rather than me describe all of them to you, just go check them out online at vincerowatches.com/brainfood. You'll also find a link in the description below. And now, how about some bonus facts? If you've seen the Steven Spielberg biographical movie Lincoln, you've heard the ticking of one of Abraham Lincoln's watches. No, it wasn't the one with the inscription on it, it was the one that Lincoln was wearing when he died. Spielberg wanted to include the sound of a watch from Lincoln's time. This second watch was in the care of the Kentucky Historical Society. They decided to see if the watch, which had been silent for 150 years, would start working again. It did, and the film crew was able to record it for Lincoln. Spielberg actually approached the Smithsonian about recording the inscription watch, but they turned him down, thinking it was too risky. For the record, by the way, no real harm was done to the other watch. And now for another bonus fact. Abraham Lincoln established the Secret Service on the day he was shot by John Wilkes Booth. That said, even had the organization been instituted earlier, it wouldn't have helped. The Secret Service in the beginning had no part in protecting the president, but rather they were tasked with cutting down on the amazing amount of counterfeit money circulated in the United States at the time. Hence why, until March of 2003, they were a branch of the US Department of the Treasury. It's estimated that at the time the Secret Service was established, 1/3 of all currency was counterfeit. And now for another bonus fact. While Lincoln is rightly almost universally considered the greatest of all US presidents, he also had his fair share of blemishes, which you're probably more likely not to have heard of. So those are the things we're going to cover here, rather than the usual, more known stuff. For instance, Lincoln's wife is known to have accepted money in exchange for Lincoln appointing certain people to various positions. Lincoln often lamented his wife doing this, but was apparently powerless to stop her. More to the point, he went ahead and gave out the positions as she requested. More scandalous than this, and very controversial in his day, as it was more recently when Bush did it, was that Lincoln suspended habeas corpus for a time. It was then decreed that anyone engaged by act, speech, or writing in discouraging volunteer enlistments, or in any way giving aid and comfort to the enemy, or in any other disloyal practice against the United States, could be arrested and tried by a military tribunal. This was extremely controversial, particularly that last bit, any other disloyal practice against the United States. With this, if you simply criticized the president or the US, you could be arrested. For instance, one man was arrested by Union General Henry Halleck for stating, "I wouldn't wipe my ass with the stars and stripes," but otherwise he had committed no other crime. In total, an estimated 15,000 US civilians were arrested and held. Some were eventually given trials, but not in front of a civil court. They were tried in front of a military tribunal. These arrests drastically dropped after it was determined, a month after Lincoln made his decree, that the police and the military were arresting far too many people who posed no threat and had committed no crime. However, the agents were simply told to use more discretion when making arrests. Lincoln did not undo his suspension of habeas corpus, and the unjust arrests continued, albeit at a slower pace. Lincoln did, however, stipulate that no one could be put to death for treason without his say-so. Many people would have indeed been executed for treason without cause had it not been for him pardoning them. Most, however, they were simply given time in prison or sentenced to hard labor, again, often for committing no actual crime. Another little-known Lincoln fact involves his beard. You'll note in pre-presidential photographs that he doesn't actually have one. He grew one after an 11-year-old girl, Grace Bedell, wrote him a letter and suggested that if you let your whiskers grow, I will try and get the rest of them, her family, to vote for you. You would look a great deal better, for your face is so thin. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you would be president. Lincoln responded to the letter, and while he didn't say he was going to grow a beard, Lincoln within weeks had his famous beard. He later met Bedell and said, "Gracie, look at my whiskers. I have been growing them for you." Bedell states he then kissed her and walked away, which was the only time she got to meet him in person. And now for another bonus fact. Yet another little-known Lincoln fact is that he was once the co-owner of a saloon called Berry and Lincoln. Also, if you believe an account of two of his close friends, Joshua S. Speed and William Herndon, the latter of which was his law partner, Lincoln occasionally visited prostitutes before he was married and for a time thought he'd contracted syphilis from doing this. Of course, visiting prostitutes wasn't that uncommon for the day, nor today in many parts of the world, but nevertheless goes against the grain of the whitewashed image of him generally touted after his death. However, apparently even during his liaisons, he was as honest as ever. During one instance, his friend reported Lincoln only had $3, but the woman charged $5. She said she'd trust that he'd pay the balance when he could, but he wasn't so sure of his ability to do so and didn't want to shortchange her if he was later unable, so he got back dressed, much to the surprise of the woman, who was thoroughly amused. So I really hope you found that video interesting. Just a reminder to go check out Vincero Watches. You can find a link to that in the description below. Thanks to them for sponsoring this video and making it all possible. Also, do not forget to subscribe to this channel. And why not check out my podcast? It's called BrainFood. It's a bit like this, but longer form. Me and Davin, we just have a bit of a chat about something fun. You can find a link to that in the description as well. And as always, thank you for watching.